So I can start with a short introduction. My name is Michael Landesmann, and I'm going to moderate this webinar. When we announced the webinar, I mentioned that we are going to deal with medium and longer term impacts of COVID-19, of the crisis, and also the appropriate policy responses beyond the immediate experience, which we are all undergoing at the moment. So we don't want to discuss too much the impacts of the lockdown phases, which are currently and still worryingly for all of us still ongoing. But we want to assess the implications for longer term developments, the legacy of the crisis, and of course also the policy responses as they unfold, and our own conclusions and suggestions in terms of longer term policy responses. And there are two parts, basically. One is to assess the structural impact of the COVID crisis on different activities, on different industries, on different groups of society, on the people who can do homework and those who cannot, on the activities which are strongly affected by the restrictions on mobility, on gender, on women and men, on the young who were about to enter the labor market and had very different expectations, and those who cannot start or continue training, apprenticeships, etc. But there are also longer run issues which were debated before the crisis and which will shape the longer run structural changes and developments which we have to face, such as those linked to digitization, the issues much debated before the crisis, and of course the sharp shift towards climate change and environmental policy responses. Some of these pre-crisis debates and developments have been speeded up during the crisis, and others have moved more into the background. But there is no doubt that these developments, these longer-term developments, not directly related to the COVID crisis, will also shape longer-term employment patterns, work organization, and the demand for different skills. So the second aspect, apart from assessing these structural developments coming out of the crisis and the longer-term developments, are the shifts in policy. In fact, Barth will call it the structural shifts in the policy agenda, which have also taken place during the crisis, both at the EU level and of course at national levels. To which extent will such policy shifts be sustained? Or are they only short-term reactions in the face of the immediate crisis, the health crisis, and the immediate economic crisis which is unfolding? There were major policy efforts at national and EU levels, which are really considered of an unprecedented type, both in scale and also in terms of the specific policy packages, quite a few of them rather innovations. Some of them led to a widespread dissemination of policy frameworks or policy steps which used to be confined to a few countries, like the short-term work schemes, which are now adopted across the EU countries. Some policies were mainly of the macroeconomic type, basically to support aggregate demand during the crisis. And these macroeconomic policy frameworks and their debates about them and their continuation will be very important to get out of the massive jobs crisis, which will definitely be a very, very strong and probably the main legacy of the COVID crisis for some time to come. Others were more specific policies directed to support particular groups, and we will hear quite a bit about those, such as those directed towards the self-employed or training activities linked to employment policies. So these were conducted, a lot of them at the national level, and of course at the EU level as well. And there's widespread acclaim that there was a major push, differently, I think, from what we experienced after the financial crisis, towards a much more coordinated policy response. And also, very importantly, some joint shouldering of the costs to fight the economic and, of course, the health aspects of the crisis. The most remarkable of those is, of course, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, but there are many others. But our question in this seminar is whether there is an ongoing continuation and legacy of these policy innovations and such policy coordination. social policy initiatives at the EU level have been well underway even before the crisis, such as the Pillar of Social Rights. But there were many initiatives in the social policy field which the panelists are really experts on and will be discussed at this webinar. Have these initiatives got another push from the crisis, and are they going to be complemented by further efforts, which together might have the potential to significantly strengthen the social pillar of the European Union? And how are the age-old problems of heterogeneity in the European Union going to be overcome? Levels and structures of social security supports differ strongly across member countries, and policies aimed at convergence often encountered serious resistances in the past. In the UK at the moment, there's the term levelling up, which has become very fashionable. But how realistic is such levelling up in the context of the European Union with widely differing social security systems? So these are the core issues which we're going to discuss today. I will not use much time to introduce the experts on this panel, as you can read about them in the blurbs which announced the webinar, but rather shortly, and starting with Maria Jepsen. She's currently the acting executive director and normally the deputy director of Eurofound, European foundation specializing on analyzing labor markets, work, social policies, headquartered in Dublin. She's also professor in labor economics at the Free University of Brussels. I should mention one of the rather exciting publications which came out of Eurofound recently is, she will mention it herself, I'm sure, Living and Working and COVID-19. It's based on 2 surveys by now which have been done, and I think there will be further surveys which examine carefully the employment, work organization, and social aspects of the COVID crisis. Bart van Herke is director of the Brussels-based European Social Observatory. He's quite busy at the moment organizing quite a lot of webinars on the basis of a recent, rather important, weighty publication called Social Policy in the European Union. Both these two publications we will reference to in the webinar. And lastly, Georg Fischer, who is now with us at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, but he was for many years working at the European Commission in DG Employment, Social Affairs. He was director for Social Affairs in DG Employment in his last appointments. So let me just tell you how we proceed with this webinar. We will have 2 rounds amongst the panelists, starting with 2 presentations, one by Maria and then by Bart. That will be followed by a commentary by Georg Fischer, who will relate to these 2 presentations, and also introduce a second round where we deepen our discussion on policy issues, policy proposals, and prospects of sustaining and further developing the policy frameworks and policy tools which are developing both at the national and the EU level. And then, of course, we are open to questions and comments from the audience. So please use the chat function on the side. We will collect these questions. So the introductory part, where the panelists are mainly talking, will be about 45-50 minutes. And afterwards, we will have time for 20-25 minutes for discussion. So without further ado, my thanks again for the panelists to participating. And Maria will start with her presentation.
So I think that my presentation is
okay,
will fantastic.
Upload you.
From the start. Okay, I'll put it back to the start. So yeah, I have this daunting task of trying to set out what I think, or what we at Eurofound think that our analysis shows will be the challenging and the challenges in the medium to long term. And I've got like 10 minutes to do this. A little bit of a daunting challenge, but I'll try to highlight some issues that I think we need to consider when we talk about the medium to long term challenges and what we need to engage with. So as was already said by Michael, this presentation is based on basically two publications, I would say. One of the publications hasn't been published yet. So the first one is based on an e-survey that we've been running since beginning of April last year. And we ran two rounds, and basically these e-surveys, they go out via snowballing and Facebook, so that they're not representative as such. And then the results are published in a publication called Living and Working with COVID-19. We have another report coming out in a couple of months called COVID-19, Some Implications for Employment and Working Life, where we go beyond only using the e-survey. We also use a database you can access on our website, which is called Policy Watch, and basically where we have more than 1,000 of the policy initiatives that have been undertaken since the start of the COVID crisis. So these two data sets is really where I gathered my presentation. So going into this, what I'll be talking towards is a little bit about the labor market and social impacts, because I think it's really important to understand who are the groups being hit and how are they being hit and why are they being hit. And that will help us a little bit to formulate our policy responses in the future. Then I'll go a little bit to the policy responses, but I'll really touch on this very briefly, because we'll have a talk about this in the second round, and then I have a slide on what's next that I might have to save for the second round. So on the economic impact, as this graph shows, and I think that we're all very well aware of, is that the GDP took a major hit, and that the unemployment rate has not at all reacted to the same extent, as you would expect with such a huge hit on the GDP. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but two of the main reasons, of course, is the short time, what we call short time working schemes, and the massive deployment of telework. So these two have kind of acted as buffers against unemployment rate. But the unemployment rate only shows us a part of the picture, right? The data on unemployment basically does not show us really what's going on. And when we look at what's really going on, first of all, we have to take into consideration that we got different groups in the labor market, which are employed, unemployed, and inactive. And if we look at this transition, this mapping out of the transitions, and this is, unfortunately, the data I have here is only the second quarter of last year. What we see is that the flows have basically gone from unemployment and employment towards inactivity. Okay, of course, from employment to unemployment, but both from unemployment and employment towards inactivity, which means that we might not see the unemployment rate going up very much, but we do see the inactivity rate going up. So, and inactivity is a much harder group to actually work with than unemployed. So that's one. The second is, of course, that a lot of the employed people are employed but not working, or are employed but working on reduced hours. So in terms of activity, the volume has basically decreased, and while if only focusing on the unemployment rate, we do not grasp the extent to which the activity, the volume activity has actually decreased. So while we can say the policy measures that have been put into place has definitely buffered up the massive economic impact that has hit, we could expect to see some of the effects kind of trickling through over the next months and peak at a certain moment when we get into the recovery phase. If we then look at, okay, so who has actually, where has actually this labor market impacted? And that will give us a little bit of a hint of what we need to grasp with. If we look at here, we have broken down the data by age and by sex, and looked at what's happened with regard to the employment, weekly hours worked, and employed but did not work. What we do in a really fast, just saying it really fast, is what we observe is that it's in particular young people between 15 and 40 years that have taken the brunt of this impact in terms of losing employment, but also in terms of being employed but not working. So that means furloughed workers. They have had much less of a decrease in the weekly hours. Another group of people that one would like to take a look at are women, because in this crisis, the way it's set out, women are bearing a larger brunt of the impact than men, both in terms of employment and in terms of furloughing. Some of this what's going on with women is not true for all countries. It's a very varied picture. That's one thing. And the second is that while women have been hardly hit in certain sectors like hospitality, retail, and so forth, there has also been an increased demand in other sectors, which has more to do with the care sector. So there's a little bit of a flux with regard to women. But so one would like to keep a close eye on young people and on the women in the labor market and out of the labor market. But what one can see here is that clearly in terms of the hit on employment, weekly hours worked and employment did not work differs across the various groups. So one cannot draw a blanket conclusion with regard to what's going on. The second issue that I would like to engage with is in terms of sectors. And in terms of sectors, as I already said, we have especially the hospitality sector, we've got the retail sector, tourism that has taken a very hard hit. And one can ask oneself when these sectors are going to go back to something that looks like the new normal and what the new normal would look like. So even though the activity in these sectors have gone down due to a very abrupt cut in demand, it is a little bit of a crystal ball to see how they're going to go back into the new normal and what the new normal will look like. So we could expect that there will be a lot of transitions across sectors that would need to be operated. And this among a population of mostly low-paid workers, because that's another factor that one would need to look at, is that in terms of occupations, it's in particular the lower paid segment of the labor market where the more negative impacts have taken place, being with regard to furloughing, but also with regard to employment. Mainly one of the reasons why this is the case is because many of these occupations do not allow for telework. The higher educated in the service sector have basically all 50% or more have turned towards teleworking, and hence furloughing or unemployment have been less of a reaction in these sectors. So very different across. But this means that we're having inequalities that are being compounded that were already present in the labor markets. And this is as we hit into a sense of recovery. Turn a little bit more towards women. So for the young people, it's with they have a real issue because the sectors where they're massively presented are hits. They're hit on their well-being. The young people suffer much more from the COVID crisis and the confinement than other groups in society. And furthermore, they are having problems with their educational trajectories and transitions into the labor market. On the women, as I showed, they are harder hit in terms of employment, but also if they are able to continue to work and they are able to continue to work from home, they have other issues within the household, namely with regard to the work-life balance, where they seem to be much harder challenged with regard to being able to continue to work and at the same time being able to balance their private lives. And this in particular when there's a presence of young children, and that is clearly hitting on women's well-being and ability to combine work and private life. How this will filter in the longer run is something that one needs to consider and one needs to keep an eye on. But what is really worrying in this sense is also that it's also women with children that have the highest negative impact in terms of financial security. Basically, women with children, they have no savings. And as they've taken this impact on the labor market, they are now in a very dire financial situation, despite the fact that there has been a massive rollout of public policy in terms of supporting, in some countries more generous than others. There is still it is still a worrying fact to look at the financial insecurity or security of women, in particular when with children. So that's another factor that one would need to kind of really take care. With regard to then the last factor that I would like to talk to is the emergence of the new telework generation. Then, and I think this is not a surprise, but the studies that have been made until now is who is a new telework generation. In a shorthand, these are younger workers. These are workers with a higher level of education, and these are urban workers. So very much a very particular group of workers that are able, or very large and particular group of workers that is able to benefit from teleworking. And teleworking is not going to go away. Most workers will want to continue, companies will want to continue for various reasons and different reasons probably, and that raises a whole host of challenges with regard to how to regulate this new kind of work. So what do we do with working time? What do we do with occupational health and safety? Who pays for the equipment? Who pays for the utilities? On all kind of questions that are kind of raised around this new kind of more mobile way of perceiving where one works for. So where lies the responsibility? There's also a question coming up around this about what will happen to employment relationships once the telework becomes more kind of the new normal in the work. Like how much will be telework? That of course remains to be seen, but it will clearly be a much larger part of the way that we work than it is these days. So I just get to my last slide in terms of, I said it was an unprecedented breadth of interventions, and 35% of these were supporting businesses, 20 sought to protect incomes, and 13 on the protection of employment. You know, we've never seen such a large breadth of kind of protective measures having been put forward in such a short time. But despite this, we still have all these challenges coming up in terms of compounding inequalities. So what we need to kind of take a look at in the future, and this is where I'll end, is to say, you know, the measures are still out there. They're being prolonged as we're getting into the second and third wave of the COVID. And with the vaccine, hoping to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but the tunnel looks very long, as some people say. But while we do this and we try to turn towards the recovery in terms of policy measures, it is important that when we look at them, that we take the existing inequalities into account, and we actually do realize that some of them have been compounded, like young people, the rise in needs, the rise in inactivity, and the impact on women need to be filtered into this. We need to work on the transitions towards recovery. Well, it's being focused on unemployed, but also very much on the inactive, because there's going to be an important inflow into the inactive. The effects of telework, as I said, need to be addressed in terms of to have this as a positive and constructive way of working, moving forward. And another telling issue that has been put forward is the large rollout of income support for self-employed. Now, this has been a subject that has been on the table for many, many years. And I think the COVID crisis has shown that we might need to do a little bit more considerations in terms of what it actually means to provide support for self-employed, not only on an ad hoc basis, but also in kind of more structural ways. And then what I did not talk about, but which is something that has less of an emphasis and has not been very much promoted during the past year, is the emphasis on training and recruitment support. You know, one could say with all this downtime that more effort should be put into training, towards the carbon neutral and digital transition, but this seems not really to have been taken up as an opportunity. And I think that here we can draw the same conclusions as we did during the last crisis, namely that you cannot roll out a structural and strong training effort in a crisis situation. This is what we concluded for the 2008 crisis, and I think we're going to conclude exactly the same after this crisis. So we might want to learn from this and set up some kind of more permanent structural crisis management features that we can reboot once we get into situations as we are these days. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. In the meantime, quite a lot of questions and comments came in. I keep most of them towards the end, but two of them you might want to answer straight away. And probably there's lots of material in your reports. One is whether we have data on the impact on migrants and non-migrants, differential impact. And the second one, information on regional variations within countries. Across countries, we know there's a lot of information already in EU publications and in yours, but also regional variations within countries.
On the migrant, and I have to say that with the data we're using out of our e-survey, it does not allow us to go that deep in terms of analysis. So with the migrant, non-migrant, we don't ask that question, so we don't know. With regards to the regional, we've got the data on the region, but we don't think that our data allows us to dig that deep into it. So it all depends on how many respondents we get back. But we can do urban, non-urban. That's what we do. That's kind of divide, but not on a regional level. We don't think that the data would support that kind of analysis.
Of course, these are very important issues, and I'm sure other researchers and other research projects might cover that and have to be monitored as part of the potentially long-term scarring effects also, which the COVID crisis has on regional differentiation and on integration or regress on the integration of recent waves of migrants, at least. So Bart, we move to your presentation.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Maria's challenge was to present all this impressive material in 10-15 minutes. My challenge is, of course, to speak after Maria, which is also a challenge. So thank you very much for the invitation. To begin with, I quickly swap through the names of the participants and telling from their email addresses. I see people out there from think tanks, from the Commission, from academics, students, all kinds of ministries. So I think we're in good company to put some beef on the table. So I've been asked to reflect a little bit on possible structural shifts in the post-pandemic world. Not an easy task. The good news is indeed that we just, as you kindly referred to, Michael, we just published the 21st edition of Social Policy in the European Union. So luckily there was some material there that I could build on. But this said, of course, some of what I will say here is most or all of what I will say here is quite speculative, as Maria also highlighted. Of course, it's very early days to make any firm conclusions, but okay, it's good to get the debate going, so I accept the challenge. In the absence of a crystal ball, indeed, that you will see quite a few question marks in my slides. Of course, structural shifts in the post-pandemic world. There is a whole booming literature on that topic already out there, and especially many opinions and newspaper articles. So I won't talk about technological change, the drive for self-sufficiency. There's more and more talk about the new era of geopolitics and all that. I will focus indeed on a quite limited agenda, namely with regard to social protection and labor market. I think that will be sufficient for today. So a first hypothetical structural change could be related to a move towards a more solidaristic European Union. You already see the question mark. And so we all know, and I'll be very brief on this slide, that some historic battles, at least in terms of length, at the level of the European Council last summer, ultimately resulted in unprecedented EU initiatives, which were deemed impossible even a few months before they were agreed upon, which is more, they have been agreed upon over a period of no more than a few weeks. I won't go into the different stages. I think many people are familiar with that. In March 2020, there were a number of relaxations of state aid rules, of the budget rules, etc. Then only 1 month later, There were these financial firewalls that have been created, including SURE mechanism, which was already referred to by Maria. And then in May 2020, of course, and Michael, you referred to that, the Next Generation EU, which combined with the increased long-term EU budget brought the EU to, I think it's fair to say, a mind-boggling budget of 1.8 trillion euros. Just try to imagine that figure. I think it has 12 knots or something like that. Anyway, so what does this tell us? That's the question. What it does tell us certainly is that member states overcame a number of historic taboos, including with regard to explicit fiscal transfers between member states. And what's more and more commentators are speculating upon is that in view of the fact that public policies, including EU policies, have a tendency to follow a path-dependent trajectory, that the one-off measures that have been taken in the context of COVID-19 might indeed end up to be the new normal. Of course, we don't know that yet, but this is, I think, it is quite likely indeed. So one can wonder whether member states finally understood that some kind of solidarity in the sense of mutual responsibility is needed to uphold the monetary union. And in that sense, that this could be the start of a more solidaristic EU. Frank van den Broeke and others have written about SURE as the linchpin for an actual European unemployment benefit scheme, and Next Generation EU as the start of more EU involvement in domestic social policies, which is an immense opportunity, but also, I would argue, entails some serious risks for the EU. Structural shift number one with a question mark. A second shift is related to the first one, namely the hypothetical end of austerity as we knew it. And this is very hypothetical. I'm very prudent and especially not naive. What we can see, and I think Maria also pointed that out, the reforms that have been undertaken are unprecedented. The EU's response is unprecedented and stands in stark contrast to the austerity-driven policies of the 2008 crisis. The Commission, the IMF, the World Bank, what have you, are recommending member states to spend their way out of the pandemic. What a contrast indeed. This said, what does this imply? Does it mean that the idea of austerity is gone? Does it mean that the people who had these ideas are gone? Or does it simply mean that the people who pushed for these ideas at the time have been silenced for now, and they will come back from the moment that they can? In any case, there is, since you asked me to speculate about fundamental change or structural change, there is indeed the possibility that, as Martin Mayent wrote in our book, that the measures taken by the EU and the member states will in the end reveal to have been a short aberration, which is followed by renewed austerity, which will have huge implications, by the way, also for the use of the Recovery and Facility Fund, but I won't go into that. There is indeed the other possibility that some people have changed their mind and that the end of austerity, which had such a detrimental impact in the past crisis, is largely or partially off the agenda. This brings me to a third point, and to some extent, Maria has already captured this very nicely. The recession, the pandemic put the gaps in social security nets very firmly on the agenda, notably with regard to certain groups. I won't repeat them. Maria did a very good job at that. What we can see is that while, I mean, on the one hand, gaps have exploded to some extent. On the other hand, it's also clear that the crisis response by the member states, as Maria described it, demonstrated the possibility of radical and rapid development of stronger and more inclusive social protection schemes. And this, I would say, is the upside of the story. So contrary to what many were assuming before COVID-19, it doesn't necessarily take years to have these reforms. Many member states in practice amended the eligibility and receipt conditions of certain social security benefits, notably unemployment and sickness, lowered qualifying periods, and thereby increased the effective access to these benefits, which is, of course, which was essential. I should also add that 2/3 of the member states included the self-employed in leave arrangements, and in most cases giving them similar access to as the one that employees have. So can we say that there is a structural shift or a fundamental shift with regard to more inclusive social protection systems? Well, let's see. Let's be careful. As we said, the jury is still out. We are conducting research for the moment for the European Trade Union Institute, which will come out in a few weeks. We should be prudent in the sense that formal access to social protection schemes remain basically the same for non-standard workers and self-employed before and after these COVID-19 related measures, meaning that those who didn't have access to an employment remained excluded also in times of COVID-19, with two exceptions, Sweden and Lithuania. And instead, what you see is that member states introduced temporary, in many cases one-off, flat rate and means-tested benefits, which was in a way damage control. And so this is not the same as opening up unemployment schemes to these categories of workers. The jury is still out whether these measures could become an acquis, could remain on the agenda. We'll have to see whether the crisis, the pandemic, may be helped by the Council recommendation on access to social protection, which is now being implemented. So whether these elements will indeed spur political debates at the national level on permanently including some categories of workers in statutory social protection. To be seen. This could be a third shift, but I'm being very careful here, as you see, Michael. Brings me to the fourth of 7 potential structural shifts. I can be brief on that because it's linked to the previous point. Can we speculate about an enhanced role for EU governments, for governments more generally? The pandemic, as we just saw, as we highlighted, both Maria and I, obliged governments in a way to play a more important role in social protection, at least in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Public authorities, for example, stepped in decisively to finance directly sick pay and sickness benefits. And most of these ad hoc emergency measures have been paid directly from the state budget and not through social contributions. So this leads to this has led some people to speculate about the size of governments, which may be larger post-pandemic, including in healthcare infrastructure. And one can indeed wonder whether this pandemic-related interventions led to a legitimacy for higher taxes to finance such an expanded role. I don't want to be naive in this respect, but you asked me to speculate, so I try to speculate a little bit. And just to give you 2 examples, there are some scholars who have started to work on a post-pandemic insurance scheme for the self-employed, unemployment insurance scheme for the self-employed, and some have wondered or are wondering whether what is happening now and this enhanced role for governments in social protection could provide an additional impetus for on the ongoing debate regarding minimum wage and minimum income. Structural shift number 4, we shall see. Leads me to my fifth hypothetical shift, rebalancing gender division of labor. Maria also referred to that, so I won't say anything about the gendered impact of the crisis. It has been covered. Maybe just signal the last bullet point here on this slide, namely that the design of social protection schemes in practice hinders women's effective access to social protection benefits, in addition to the fact that they have been hit harder by job losses, etc. So why do I dare to put rebalancing gender division of labor as a potential structural shift? And again, I'm being very prudent here. I'm saying that because, again, in the book that we just published on social policy in the EU, scholars like Jill Rubery and Isabel Tavora underscore that at the same time, caring and household responsibilities fell essentially on women. Marie also said that. And we see that there is, or they found, these scholars, that across the EU there has been a significant increase in fathers' involvement in childcare during the confinement. Second point is that jobs mainly done by women, including in health and care services, are now being recognized in many countries for their key value of society, which has already led in some countries, including my own Belgium, to discussions about the respect to the fairness of existing wage structures. Could this have lasting effects on social norms and the gender division of labor? If it would, this could become a structural shift, but again, hypothetical. By the way, if you want to know more about gender equality and in-work poverty, you should attend this seminar at the end of the week. But I don't know if I was allowed to make publicity. So I'll move on to my sixth point. 6 out of the 7, towards an enhanced EU role in health. And there was a question by Alexandra in the chat box, so I'd be happy to respond to that point later on if there is time. What I can say there is that, and here I'm again building on my book, what struck us all, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic is the confusion, the closing of borders, etc. With some hindsight, however, Scott Greer and other authors in our book argue that what stands out is really how quickly member states began to work together in the midst of the health crisis, which also started a public debate, and especially among policymakers, of course, on potentially strengthening the role of the EU in health. At the same time, let's not be naive. The Commission proposed a very ambitious EU for Health program, which is still ambitious. It's still the biggest EU health program that we've had ever. But at the same time, member states decided to slash its budget because they are still not very happy about the EU mingling in their national health systems. At the same time, it is very clear that the Commission quite creatively used the space that is now available to expand its role in health against member states' low appetite in this area. And so we'll have to see, which kind of equilibrium results from that. But I think we are looking at a real shift in this respect. I don't know if there will be treaty changes, but we're looking at an enhanced role for the EU in health. And that would be a big change. My final point, anchoring of social affairs players, again, quite speculative, and the jury is still out. This is linked to the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which provides, of course, the bulk of the Next Generation EU funding. If you look at the proposals that are on the table now, the management of this fund is entrusted to the Secretary General of the Commission, to DG ECFIN of the Commission, and is subject to the control of the Member States, namely through the Economic and Finance Committee. Which means that at first sight, at least, the social affairs players, DG Employment, the Ministers for Social Affairs, the social partners, etc., have lost much of the voice which they had acquired through the slow but certain socialization of the European semester. I think this is a worrying tendency, which we should discuss here and in other places. At the same time, we should be careful. We should not jump to conclusions because, of course, nothing is rigid, and EU politics is like national politics. It moves. And what we see now is that the Social Affairs Council, the Ministers for Health, the Employment Committee, the Social Protection Committee, and other social stakeholders are getting their act together and are trying to use the power and the influence they have to get their foot in the door of the management of this new fund. And so this is the final point to conclude. Anchoring of social players. I think it's fair to say that semester offers a variety of opportunities and resources for strategic agency by actors who want to secure their place around the table. And if they succeed this time, then social affairs players may finally be able to anchor their role in the EU's economic governance, which they haven't really been able to really to do so far. So in conclusion, 7 potential structural shifts in the post-pandemic world in labor and social affairs towards a more solidaristic EU, the end of austerity as we know it, towards more inclusive social protection system, enhanced role of governments, towards more gender balanced care role, an enhanced role for the EU in health, and then finally anchoring of social affairs players in the EU's architecture. If later on in the discussion there is time, I saw questions from Kurt, Alexandra, and Gunther that are very much related to these issues, but the chair will decide whether there is time for me to respond to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bart, going in quite a lot of detail on the policy developments during the crisis, and thanks for speculating what will stick and be further developed. I wanted to just pick up basically one of the comments, basically by Kurt. You already mentioned it in your comment, which I think is, sorry, now I'm losing that place. Well, he conjectured that so far all quite extensive government interventions are either immediate COVID aid packages and or general stimulus bills, probably not fully. Nothing is visible towards climate transition, digitalization, or closing the appalling income and wealth gaps. Shouldn't these have not been included in the actual Corona packages? Probably you can take a first take on that. We will continue to discuss it later on as well.
Okay. I'll first have a quick whack at this question, and I think also Alexandra's question is linked to that. So, yeah, climate and digital, maybe things are not very visible, but I would say that they are very clearly there, namely in the Commission's proposal on the Recovery and Resilience Fund. There's an earmarking, very important earmarking for spending on climate and digital policies, meaning that once this 1.8 trillion euros are going to become available, and this is going to happen in the next months and years, of course, because this will, I think the spending will be possible until 2026, even though they need to be committed much sooner. So there will be very, very considerable amounts of money going to climate and digital. So I would say, even if it's not visible yet, the impact is going to be very clear. And I would even say more, namely that those who feared that the Green Deal would have been buried or suffered very considerably as a result of the pandemic, I think to some extent they can be reassured, namely the commitment towards, in terms of funding towards green or climate and digital spending is much higher than one could have expected when Ursula von der Leyen presented her Man on the Moon Green Deal a few months ago.
What about the income and wealth gaps? That's the other part of the question.
I'm not sure what to respond to that.
Okay, we can come back to that.
I'll leave that for Maria. But maybe Alexandra's question very quickly, because it's quite easy.
I think I come back because that's a supply chain.
Good, yeah.
I think that will be later. So probably Georg, Maria, you can come back to these questions, but probably let me bring in Georg to comment on both your presentations and lead on to the second round of discussion.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Unfortunately, you can't see me. Berlin internet is apparently very weak. But we know that in Germany they have a problem with some digitalization, so I'm not surprised. Let me say it's not easy to comment on these many points you made. I could comment now for the next 3 hours, but then most people would be gone, so I will try not to do this. Let me start with a comment on the employment trends. And then I would like to say something on youth and the social protection trends. And then in particular, I would like to comment on the last points made by Bart, but also the unprecedented measures of Maria. Are we really seeing a speed, scope, and mood change in policy? And of course we see one, but I would like to qualify this. And that will be the last part of my comments. Let me start with employment. I think Maria rightly showed the broad employment trend. We have a much stronger decline in GDP than the increase in unemployment. And this is partially due to the increase of inactivity, but also due to different measures which we tend to summarize as short-term work, although they are not in all countries particularly similar to what we think short-term work is. And indeed, the SURE EU program has very much broadened this coverage among countries by offering financial support to particularly those countries that actually need this, the South and the East. But I must say one but. Still at this very moment, the United States that has no short-time work and the United States that has had a massive increase in unemployment has now an unemployment rate below the one of Europe. So apparently there is also another way to get unemployment down. It's not the way we like, I fully agree. But there are some questions around short-time work we should not totally disregard. A second point I would like to make, and that picks up very much on the very interesting presentation by Maria on sectors. And actually I've used for that another Eurofund study. Eurofund published a study, I think last year, on where the combinations of occupation and sectors where employment increased so much in the last decade. And we found high quality, we found high educated jobs and also low educated, and we found high paid and low paid. And if one compares this now to what had happened between 2019 and between 2020, that's the third quarter, which were the latest data we could find, we actually see that mostly in those combinations of occupation and sectors where there is low pay and low skill, employment declines were really massive. And they go as far as that the whole increase in the last decade is lost. And one example is services and sales workers in hotels and restaurants, but it's almost the same for retail trade. And I would guess from this that we cannot expect this to get back to that the new normal will not be just getting back to these levels of employment in this occupation and sectors. Actually, it's the opposite for higher qualified and higher paid occupations, mostly professionals. Professionals have continued to increase even in the period of the COVID crisis. So I think in terms of polarization, we have to expect an increase in polarization. But what interests me more here is a little remark. I think it was contained in an earlier version of Maria's slides, where she said that short-time work was actually not very often accompanied by training measures. Only a couple of countries sort of oblige people who participate or companies that offer short-time work to train their workers. Very few countries actually offer serious programs in this respect. And given this prospect that we will have, in my view, we will have massive shifts in employment, the new normal will not be the old normal. Training measures and the reshaping of short-term work towards more transition support is essential. And my first question really would be, what do you see in these terms happening, and where are the angle points to really encourage member states to do this? I mean, one point is maybe the European program SURE itself, which for the moment is a one-off program, a temporary program that supports short-time work as such. But maybe that could be developed into, and Bart has mentioned this, a paper Frank van den Broeke has written, another one I have also written on this, where short-time work should really maybe move towards a European unemployment insurance scheme with some elements of minimum standards on labor market training, maybe job subsidies, maybe employment support, labor market services. I think there is a big issue, and this is an issue we should think about, and I would be interested to hear you. On youth, there's very little to add, except I am quite worried about youth development. We have this fascinating target about that we would, with the youth guarantee, within 3 months, all the young people should be either in education, training, or employment. And we actually measure this. And what we see in a number of countries, including in the South in Europe, is that we are back to need rates of the mid-2010s. We had good progress in the second half of last decade. Need rates substantially got down, but now we are back at levels we haven't seen for a long time. And there is my question now to you. I mean, the Commission has proposed, Council has adopted a reinforced youth guarantee with a promise of 22 billion euro being available to support this. But my question to you is, what is the key issue here? Is the key issue a lack of funds? Because of course the EU could never provide the 60, 70 billion euro a youth guarantee would need according to some of the calculations. I mean, that will always have to be a mix of money from the member states and of the EU. Or is the key issue here the design of this, of the way how the youth guarantee is drafted? And we find actually in this council document a number of new ideas how the youth guarantee could be reshaped. And I was interested to read all these new ideas. Or where is the point really where we should act politically? That would be my second question. I can't really add anything on teleworking and home working. I think Maria made a very good presentation for the short time. I would just like to put one question in the room isn't it time to think about how policy could influence the way how technological change is carried out? This is a question which is now discussed in the United States, and I think the Biden administration might do something about this. And isn't this now the moment where we should also talk about this? Or should we simply accept the way how technological change takes place and then deal with the employment impacts always exposed? Then let me say one sentence on social protection. I think Bart is absolutely right that there were massive changes, progress in covering people who were typically not covered or badly covered by social protection. This is, by the way, also true to some extent for labor protection. And this is very much in line with the last few initiatives of the Juncker Commission on social protection for all, on the work contract, on leave and rights of workers who take leave. So this is certainly a positive trend and reflects, I would say, a broader change in thinking, which also is reflected in the European Pillar of Social Rights. But I also agree with Bart, and I would very much underline this. These are one-off measures, temporary improvements, if one likes. And the real question is, how can they be regularized? What needs to be done to make them permanent? And I have my doubts that they can simply be transformed into permanent provisions. Systems need to change to cover these people better. And there's an important point which I think one would need to explore further. And this applies even to some extent, and I might want to say this because I was as a director in charge of some of these directives. Also for these directives, isn't this the moment where some of the battles we lost when we put these directives to the council in terms of making them compulsory like the social protection document? or including all workers, not following national definitions of workers, wouldn't there be a chance to go back and go a step further in terms of EU commitment member states? Just one thing.
Georg, try to come to an end, so there's time for answers.
I agree, this is all unprecedented, this is all very fast, the scope is very wide. But now comes my but. The but is we seem to assume that this positive mood will continue. And there I just would like to clarify one misunderstanding about what happened 2008 and 2009 and 2010 and 2011. 2008 and 2009, we had a very similar situation what we see now. All member states expanded their budgets. They also expanded social programs. They didn't go into the type of coverage expansions as were happening now, but maybe they were also less necessary because this was very much an industrial crisis. But there was a massive increase also in social policy expenditures 2008 and 2009. And then the mood changed and the austerity mood came into the picture. And my worry is that I'm not saying the same will happen now. There are good reasons, and I think Bart mentioned some of them, why this should not be happening, but it will deserve a lot of policy attention and a lot of policy efforts to try to avoid this. And if I conclude, I would just say one issue we haven't discussed about, but this is taxation. Because honestly, I don't think we can use the argument that all this can be funded through debt financing forever. We can say this now, of course, and the international organizations support this. But if we would like to regularize expansions in social protection schemes, whether nationally or at the EU level, let's assume we do something like the European Unemployment Insurance Scheme, or we do a basic minimum income scheme at the EU level, they would need to be financed. And I think this raises the issue of taxation at the EU level, as well as the issue of taxation at national level. So I think a broader policy approach would need to raise this. And I was happy to see that the Commission has actually made a few proposals for new EU taxes, and I can come back to this later on. But I think we should not ignore this point. And with that, I would conclude.
Thank you, Georg. So all very important issues. And let me give a chance for Maria and Bart to respond. Probably the points, just some. One was the polarization on occupations. There's too little done on training. The youth worry and the high levels of needs and how they might get absorbed. I also want to feed in some of the questions from the public. One, probably Maria could also address this income and wealth gap issue. I think probably Georg's last point on taxation might link up with that. Let me just, I think the issue whether policies which are put in place now need quite a bit of further development to become permanent provisions, or in which way is this translation going to take place? So Maria, if you may want to start us.
Very brief in my responses. What Georg mentioned in terms of future development in the sectors and hence occupations and the polarization. I mean, the fact is that we've lost a lot of low-paid jobs. So basically, we're going away from the polarization. Polarization was that we would get more low-paid and more high-end jobs. This is what has come to a stop with this. Will we get it again? I think so. I mean, because if we try to look forward in terms of what are the sectors that will continue to grow. I mean, health and care will continue to grow. Okay, it's growing more now. It's become more prominent. But even before the COVID crisis, these were the sectors that are growing. With education, a lot of these jobs are low-paid jobs. I mean, the care sector is a low-paid female sector, and it's growing. So this will continue. We will probably, as you said, see a slower rise in employment, and will we ever get back to the same levels in the hotel, restaurant, and tourism sector? Not quite. I mean, quite sure. As you said, that there had been a development. Will we get back to the same? Probably not in the near future, and the high-end jobs will continue to grow. So those are kind of the standard trends. On top of this, we have to take the Green Deal into account. We have to take the climate neutral transformation that we're going towards. Now, as Bart was talking about it, I mean, I would go even further. This is the new political policy. The new political policy is the climate neutral aim. And it's going to drive a lot of the way that we invest, a lot of the way that we do business, a lot of the way that we move forward. It's kind of a little bit counterintuitive to what we see right now, but the recovery will very much be framed within the climate neutral narrative. And here, a lot of the jobs, they are not low paid, but they are more in the medium sector. We've done at Eurofund, we've done some projections in terms of what it means to hit the Paris Agreement. And hitting the Paris Agreement means that there will be a net employment creation, and the net employment creation is especially be in the low and mid sectors of the labor market. So it's construction, it's utilities, it's waste management and so forth. So and a lot of other jobs. So we will see probably different low-paid jobs, and in the medium sector, maybe not the same as we have today. But I think it's really something that it merits a very, very close monitoring to be order to ensure that we don't get to a widening of inequalities. Because I mean that could happen as we move into recovery. With regard to the training, yeah. So I didn't get to this point, but it's very I did mention a little bit of saying, like, in 2008 we said we would train in downtime. 2021 we're saying exactly the same, and we're still not doing it. And we're not doing it because we don't have the structures that we can start once we are in a crisis situation. And we know that building up institutions in crisis situations is a very, very difficult task. And that brings me then to, so that's training during downtime. But then we get to the transition, because we will see, I guess we're already seeing an increase in activity in restructuring, and this is going to go. It's going to become more intense as we move forward. And here it gets to what I was saying with regards to the climate neutral. It gets to the youth. It's still a daunting task to train so high numbers of people at the same time. And if you don't have the programs, you need to set them up. You need to find the trainers. You need to find the infrastructure. You need to find the process and so forth. You have to work very fast and very diligent to be able to put something meaningful in place for the people that need the training to be able to transition into other sectors. And I think that's where everybody needs to put their headlights these days, is how can we kind of anticipate, and how can we put this forward? I'm not going to I'm not going to comment back on the reinforcement of the youth guarantee. I have to say I was glad to see that it came out so fast. I was glad to see that it was there and it's being rolled out. Now, is it going to be able to deal with the entire youth problem? Of course not. I mean, it's still at the national and regional and local level that the countries need to come to grips with this. We're having more people flowing into inactivity, and that's also why we see the needs flowing up. And we know that the youth that kind of transit out of education and employment at a young age, they're extremely difficult to get back. And that comes back to the training I was talking about. We need to tackle this in a very diligent and very forceful way. And some of it is money, but clearly not all of it. It has to be meaningful. One needs to have something meaningful to say in order to actually be able to get the youth to engage with this. And if the jobs are not around, it's very difficult to motivate anybody to engage with anything. So, and that's the situation we're at right now. We'll probably be somewhere else in 6 months. The last thing that I think I would like to comment on is what you said about what we did in 2008 and 2009. And you're completely right. And I keep on making exactly that point, that watch the space, because 2008, 2009, there were discretionary stimulus. We went out, Social Security was expanded to capture better non-standard employment and so forth and so forth. So it was not as big as what we're seeing today, but it was definitely there. And a couple of years after, the brakes were put on. My assumption is that there's going to be a little bit of a panic mode at a certain moment, that's for sure. I mean, I think anybody would panic with those kind of debt levels going up. But on the other hand, if you weigh it against the damage that the way we dealt with the crisis last time, I think, you do your cost benefit analysis and you say, okay, we might not want to put the brakes on the way we did it last time, because the impact we still have it today, as we have to do it in a different way. So I'm a little bit more positive in terms of, repeating some of the mistakes from the last crisis, but I do think that we need to watch the space.
Thank you, Maria. Probably about before you answer, I feed in some of the questions from the audience. Some of them are issues which we didn't cover at all, like supply side issues. Carl mentions the medium and long-term productivity impact of the crisis, the issue of zombie firms, zombie employment positions, probably structural conservation and policies which might be more proactive in this way. There was also a question on a worry about security issues, that the shift in budgetary emphasis might reduce defense investment, and there's a lower budget for that. You yourself wanted to pick up the issue about supply chains, reshoring by Alexandra. There was quite a number of people who asked your positions on the feasibility and probably your assessment of basic incomes support. And I think the issue of austerity backlash and how this affects all the other things, I think, is mentioned by a number of commentators. So, Bart, quite a menu.
Yes, and then you'll probably say that I have to respond in 3 minutes or so, right?
Well, I think since I brought in the questions from the audience, you can
all right, very good.
take them. Yes.
Okay. Okay. No, we have time. I have time until 8 o'clock, so no problem. No, just kidding. So yeah, I'll pick up on some of these questions also from Georg. Thank you very much, Georg. We don't see you, but in spirit and your brain is clearly with us. So thank you for that. So maybe start with another question from Alexandra. I think she's from Kassel University. So she kindly shared a link to a call from a number of academics calling for pan-European commitment for rapid and sustained reduction in SARS-CoV-2 infections, and she asked our feedback on that. I think, I mean, what the link that you share, first of all, I sympathize a lot with what is written there. And I think that this is the kind of initiatives, but also the kind of policy response that the EU could indeed give. So basically, this call asks for more, stronger coordination, better cooperation between member states, a stronger role for the EU, etc., without aiming for treaty change and all that. So I think that this is within what is reasonable and what is possible. The EU, I will already refer to that, and you know that, I suppose, Alexandra, the EU or the Commission proposed this EU for Health program. There is an agreement on the budget, even though the member states partly slashed the budget. It's still the highest health budget that we have. And I think that typically what we will see, rather than treaty changes granting the member state, the EU more competences in health, is that the EU, the Commission, will slowly but certainly stretch to the limits its competencies. It will, within EU for Health program, within this European Health Union that Ursula von der Leyen pushed for, so the existing structures and the existing competences will be used to the full, to a limit, and I think the EU can already do a lot with that. We've seen that in other fields. where there is a political will to cooperate and to use the boundaries of the treaties to the full, a lot is already possible. So I think that the example that you give there is a very nice illustration of that. And then Gunther, yeah, I don't know about defense investments, to be honest. I mean, I do political science and I work on social policies, but you do raise an important point. So thank you, Gunther, for bringing it up. Namely, so let's be clear, defense policies, I think, are going to be a no-go within the context that we are talking about, namely the semester, the recovery and resilience facility, etc. I think that's quite clear. But it does bring us to the question, what is the role of the European Commission on deciding what member states can spend this money on? Because, of course, in part, it comes from the EU budget. But the EU budget is, of course, still largely made up of, well, national contributions, and especially because part of what is going to be spent through the Recovery and Resilience Fund is going to be loans, and loans, of course, have to be reimbursed. So, you know, the question of which discretion the EU, the European Commission has to decide on what this money will, this 1.8 trillion euros can be spent on and what it cannot be spent on, what it calls investment and what it calls reforms, etc. This is going to be a very interesting test case of, you know, to what extent member states accept a bigger role from the EU, especially from the European Commission, in deciding to some extent on their national policies. And just think of the example where, let's say, a government, there is an agreement between the Commission and the government on a certain spending, then 3 weeks later or a month later, the government changes, new political priorities, a new program, then what happens? A renegotiation between member states and the Commission. There are going to be some very difficult and very interesting situations there. Georg, I sympathize a lot with your point about that and the changes that are there for now, and I also hinted at that they're not structural. They are crisis measures, and more will be needed to regularize them to some extent. And the question is indeed whether the EU has any tools to arrive there, because that when you raise this question, my reflex is always what can and should the EU do? There is this Council recommendation on access to social protection, and of course you've been involved in that debate. And let's be clear, it won't be enough. It's not nothing. There are debates now going on in the Social Protection Committee. The Commission is monitoring the policies of the member states, and we see at the national level that some actors are really seizing this Council recommendation to push for a social protection agenda, but it's not going to be enough. And I think that what is needed in this area is more protective EU legislation, and we are absolutely nowhere in this at this point, and I'm quite pessimistic on whether we will be able to walk that area. Then there's a comment from Dr. Valeria, if I pronounce your name correctly. Unconditional basic income, I'm not optimistic. Sorry about that. I mean, let's say the Commission tabled a quite daring proposal with regard to minimum wage. This is, I would say, big time. Until a year ago, it was just unthinkable that the Commission would really table a proposal for a directive, not a recommendation, a directive. Well, we will see what the outcome will be, because of course there are many differences between the member states. There are those that have statutory minimum wages, others that have that take care of them through bargaining between the social partners, etc. The Nordic trade union organizations have shut down the proposal immediately, so this is going to be a tough ball. But the proposal is there, is a proposal for a directive. Second, the whole discussion on minimum wages has revamped the discussion on a minimum income scheme. I mean, a European directive on a minimum income scheme, for which is already also going to be a very difficult discussion, but for which there is a lot of good material on the table. For basic income, in all honesty, I find that if you look at the results of the Dutch and the Finnish and some other experiments, the results of those experiments are not conclusive enough, I think, to be able to legitimize an EU initiative in this field. But that's my opinion, so I don't think it's going to happen, even though I sympathize with basic income or unconditional basic income. Let's be clear. Final point, Mr. Chairman, the austerity backlash. I agree with what Ludwig says. I mean, I don't want to be naive at all. There is a risk of a backlash, and I think Georg and Maria made very good comments on that, so I completely agree. Watch this space. This is also, by the way, why I hope that social affairs players will be able to get their space back around the political negotiation table, including with regard to economic governance instruments, because this debate is going to come back on the agenda. This said, we know much more now, as Maria said, about the damaging effects of austerity than we did 10 years ago. And there is some research, for example, in the Journal of Common Market Studies, which shows that indeed the mindset and the opinions with regard to austerity have changed as a result of the economic crisis. So I think we should be careful, but I'm not totally pessimistic. And then on taxation, Georg, you're right. So this is a very important topic. And the fact that now also, we didn't mention this during the discussion, during the compromise that was struck in the summer between the heads of state and government, there is this idea now that the Commission has the right to raise more own resources for the EU. There is talk of plastic tax, of transaction tax, digital tax, etc., which is really a breakthrough. Of course, everything needs to be negotiated. There are no concrete proposals on the table. Branimir raised a question on the chat whether this could lead to wealth tax. Oof, I think that this goes very, very far. I'm not so optimistic, but the fact that taxation is back on the EU agenda is really big time. And finally, Karel, I apologize. I didn't mean to say that the Stability and Growth Pact is buried, of course. You're totally right. It's just the escape clause that has been activated. I wouldn't dare to suggest that the Stability and Growth Pact itself has been buried. So thanks for all these very nice comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart. You also picked up some of the remaining questions which were on the chat. Georg, I want to give you the opportunity to make your final comments.
I have just three comments. One is somebody raised the issue of zombie firms and zombie jobs. I think that's for the moment, this is too early to say. I agree with Maria. We can't really say where they are, but we have to be prepared for massive structural change in the labor market, and therefore I've made the point on the need to have better labor market instruments, training, employment subsidies to help people to make transitions. But I think it's a fair point which one should not totally ignore. Kurt made the point that, of course, the real issue is as the big spenders in Europe are the member states, is what is happening with member states, what will be happening with member states' budget and austerity. I agree with that. My point is more about what should happen at the EU level. If we would like to see the EU to continue to support member state social policies, like it does now for the first time, actually, with the SURE program, my view is, of course, for the moment, this is financed by loans, but even these loans have to be paid back. And the same is true for the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And so I come to the tax issue. I think the EU will need to have some own tax revenues in order to make such social programs at the EU level permanent. And this is, of course, equally true for national governments. And that might then lead into wealth tax and so on. I think a big progress would be if one would launch the type of taxes at the EU level Bart has mentioned. The last point I would like, because Bart has made this point so often about social and finance ministers. Having spent many years, and actually I worked in both areas, yes, it is important to boost the self-confidence of social affairs ministers, because they tend to be too quiet and tend to be too easily be impacted by finance. But I think it's very important for civil society, for NGOs, for whoever, to work with finance ministers, because in the end they will make the decision in the EU. So we cannot just think that that by strengthening social affairs ministers, one can avoid the tensions with the finance ministers. I think there is a need to convince finance ministers of what Bart said before, or Maria said before, that austerity is not such a great idea and it hasn't proved particularly successful in the past.
Georg, thank you very much. Well, I think I will close this thing probably with two comments. One is, it is interesting how different, let's say, the policy debates and scenarios are compared to the financial crisis. If you think back on it, there was some innovation in the direction of banking union, a lot of talk about that one needs to build up a fiscal pillar of coordination and fiscal instruments. Not much has happened. In this crisis, the social policy angle has gone very much more on the forefront, and labor market issues, understandably, but of course there were labor market and social policy issues also in the past crisis. So I think this shift is an interesting and very important shift. The second point I wanted to make, and linked to it, the attitude towards austerity, we must have also learned something from the political developments which happened after the 2008-9 crisis, with the development of strong populist movements, shifts in electoral systems and so on. And I guess the political sphere might react towards this learning experience, and therefore one can be hopefully somewhat more optimistic that this backlash towards austerity will not be guided simply by public economic experts, public finance experts, but really by political scientists, social scientists who are following the political developments. So I think we had a very rich discussion. I want to thank you all with a lot of detailed assessments of the situation. This is obviously a very, very exciting area for researchers to look at this dramatic historical break and evolution which we are going through, with quite a lot of interesting policy innovations. And I think it's very demanding for us as economists, political scientists, also psychologists, researchers, to follow that, and I think to get very up-to-date data and trends. So I thank you very much for being courageous to also expand on your assessment of what the future will bring. And thank you also to the audience to be quite active in the contributors. We will upload the presentations. We will also upload or refer to the publications which were mentioned by both Eurofound and the European Social Observatory. And we look forward to having you again at our next webinars. And thanks, Maria, Bart, and Georg for participating. All the best. Bye-bye.